in Integral, where there's a reintegration of East and West, of rationalism, of reason, and intuition, and the imagination, and the spiritual. And so again, you could think of like also, just like in the Renaissance, the ancient Greek text kind of came back to Western Christianity. In this moment, Eastern wisdom traditions, that was the way Reeeeeal talked about it, of Buddhism, of Taoism, and so on, were being reintegrated with kind of Western reason, enriching both.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. Today, I'm joined by Rufus Pollock. Rufus is a co-founder of Life Itself, a super important hub node in the liminal web and the Metamodern integrative ecosystem, and doing some really, really cool things, mapping that ecosystem, research. We'll talk all about it in a second. And also, exploring our cultural moment through what's being dubbed the second Renaissance, which is a way of framing this moment that we're in and understanding what might be emerging. And have really enjoyed getting to know you better, Rufus, over the past couple of months, and starting to work together in various ways and explore potential means of collaboration. But it's sort of I don't know. It's unfortunate we haven't had this conversation sooner because of your super important role in this community, and so I'm delighted to finally have you on the podcast and have a little occasion for some conversation. So thanks for coming on the podcast, Rufus. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brendan. It's great to be here and talk with you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, again, I mean, what you're up to, what Life Itself is up to, is and has been super important in this space. I really think of it as one of the major nodes in this web, in this network. And so maybe, just as a way into all the million things we could talk about, you could just set up a little bit what Life Itself is and your relationship to that organization and what you're all getting up to over there.
Sure. That would be great. For people who haven't heard of Life Itself, first, I'm one of the co-founders. There's several others who are involved, and I'm here today. But we are a collective, and I'm kind of speaking with my, as it were, on behalf of with my collaborators. And so, in that to say, we are a collective of artists, entrepreneurs, academics, and contributors. We're an organization as well. In that sense, we actually legal entity and so on. And we've started, between the team, we've started several successful enterprises, been exhibited in galleries, carried out academic research at the highest levels. But in a sense, we are ordinary people choosing an extraordinary path, which is also, we've interviewed others. The idea of we are choosing this path of committing ourselves to being pragmatic utopians, to seeding a second Renaissance, to making or trying to contribute to a radically wiser, weller world. And specifically, what do we do at Life Itself? Well, we create conscious co-living hubs, so spaces where people can come and live for weeks, months, years. We start businesses to support that and to further what we're doing. We do research and we engage in kind of advocacy and activism to pioneer a wiser culture and plant the seeds of a second Renaissance. And behind that, we was founded 10 years ago. We actually kind of came together, and Life Itself began in 2015. And in that manifesto, I think was kind of core of what we were trying to do, which was be a community for people seeking a wiser world. And the context for us, the kind of founding group, was that living in societies which have never been so rich, in general, we sensed that our sense of purpose and connection was often missing. And there were a growing number of people, including ourselves, who were seeking lives that were as meaningful as well as productive, yet struggling to find that balance, often finding ourselves in conflict. And when we originally started, we wanted to offer a way to combine these kind of wiser, weller ways of living while remaining engaged in conventional society, and specifically to contribute to a shift in a society at the level, a paradigmatic shift, you might say, which is in this space, I think, an increasingly common idea. They're an integral and so on. That to have that come about practically. So that's a crucial point, was that there was this pragmatic utopianism. So this having a big kind of vision and also wanting to take practical action, embody this both in ourselves and see how that would actually come about. And there were three parts of that, which was providing space in the form of like these hubs, physical places people could be, like a home, in terms of developing a network more broadly, and in terms of kind of knowledge in the form of education and research to develop these kind of ideas. That still remains the core. That was right at the beginning, and that's kind of become more embodied in the kind of very specific elements that we now, probably two that we focus around, which is on the one hand supporting the development of an ecosystem, of a movement for this paradigmatic change, which we talked about. We've done some kind of mapping, but now both more broadly within the various ecosystem that we're a part of, and also concretely with the Second Renaissance initiative, which is both kind of specific visioning, but also a growing kind of community of people working to make that happen. And then also around what we call the praxis hubs, the integrating theory and practice, but more broadly, like a kind of supporting the path of spiritual warriorship or wise change making. How do we actually support whether ourselves and others to actually walk this path, particularly those who wish to be pioneers, who wish to really dedicate their lives in some way to helping this change come about.
Mhm.
And so those are the kind of two strong thematic elements which could flow through, the research, the advocacy, the hubs, and so on.
Yeah, that's awesome. So there's a lot there. I'd love to unpack some of that and dive into some of it with some depth. But I'm curious first just to get a sense for the role that metamodernism's played in this. I know that, so I was intrigued to learn just now that this started 10 years ago, 2015, and metamodernism wasn't really as well known at that point. Hansi Freinack hadn't published any of his books yet, that sort of thing. So I'm curious how the infusion of the metamodern into the work that you've been up to, how that occurred, and what significance you found with that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, by the way, one of the things that you're asking, which is also a question of ours, in some of the interviews we've done around this kind of what we call ordinary people, extraordinary path, is how do people come to this? What is the meandering path by which people arrive sort of in this so-called space? So from ourselves, and it varied amongst the founders. Some people came more from the climate activism end. One of my co-founders, Sylvie Bobby, who's an artist. There was Liam, who, as I said, from the climate side. For me personally, I think that I had been interested in social change since I was like a teenager. How did we really make society better? And I think looking in integral terms or somewhat metamodern terms, I would say I kind of ended up in the systems change end of things. Like, okay, so I'm going to do activism, but I'm also going to focus, in my case, my activism and advocacy work on a kind of core lever, which was, in my case, I worked in digital kind of policy, information technology. Like, how do we change the way the information economy and society worked? How could we make it, in this case, particularly open? How can we make it so that most information was openly available to people, and yet we paid creators and so on? And so I spent about 15 years. I built a non-profit in that space that became, operated internationally, Open Knowledge Foundation, and chapters in about a dozen places all over the world and so on. But I think there was some point where, putting it crudely for me, I had also been a Zen Buddhist. I'd also, taken psychedelics as a teenager, became kind of really interested in the nature of consciousness. And these two things kind of came together in the sense that I saw for myself that open knowledge did not equal open mind. So you could change, okay, everyone's got information about, corruption or about this or about the Iraq war, concretely back 15, 20 years ago now. But that didn't change necessarily people's actions. So there was this thing for me. I was very interested in Buddhism. That's where I'd kind of arrived from my kind of consciousness work and doing meditation. And there's this kind of thing about attachment to views. This idea that the kind of way that even I might crave ice cream, I really want ice cream, I really want sex, or I really want power. Actually, that also happens about being even right. Like, oh, I've got the right answer. I know better than you. And this kind of clinging, this way that our ego attaches to things happens even around our views and very deep views, not just, oh, what do I think of Barack Obama, but even what I think kind of reality is or who I think I am, and leads to quite profound errors that cause a great deal of suffering. So that idea was then, I think, that many of the people involved in life itself have come from that Buddhist, some degree of Buddhist lineage to an extent, whether they are Buddhist or not, but kind of informed by that in some ways. And so that was one way, before we even knew of like integral at that point or metamodernism, was suddenly I was arrived at this point like, oh, if you really want deep social change, if you really want to have a world where like, there's no war, or you want a world where every child is cared for and cherished and loved, or you want where there's no you want to heal trauma, if you like, if you want to do these, even act together to address the climate crisis. This goes to really deep things in our kind of being. And so that's where we were kind of starting to come from. But it wasn't, I think, for me, I came across Wilbur in 2019. And then, funny enough, very soon afterwards, I came across Hansi Freinacht. By that point, I think a lot of the view of like, oh, we wanted paradigmatic change was there. And, there's people like Joanna Macy, and there's people in other kind of lineages that I think inform the liminal web, the second Renaissance, the integral space. And then there was like Ken Wilber. And for us, like Wilber, many people have been like Wilber pilled, I think, in this
That's
space.
a great term, yeah.
I think, which I borrow from, the gentleman at the Stoa, is this aspect of being like, and that was a huge moment where things that one was doing, or that at least we had been talking about, there's a kind of rearrangement, this is kind of odd, like, I was thinking, the fact that it kind of hits you as you were thinking about some of those things, but you're suddenly like, oh, okay, the quadrants. Oh, that's all my activism. Why was I ineffective with activism? Why was I kind of stuck in like trying to get different rules about the ownership of the means of production in a digital age? And, I was stuck in all this stuff. Oh, and this is how my like Buddhist kind of world up here in the, when we do it, up in the upper left quadrant, the inner eye, and, and so on, fits together. And so that was that. There's a kind of a bunch of stuff that kind of came together then. And so then in metamodernism, we could have a discussion about what is metamodernism a little bit. For me, one aspect is that, well, I think there are a variety of it. It's a part of it that I've seen is it's obviously often for many people, certainly I know for Hansi Freinacht, obviously the real ancestor is kind of integral and Wilbur, but it's a kind of often an application of that, for example, in that case, to politics, like an integral politics, if you like, in a very worked through way. And so the path to kind of metamodernism or integral was that, which was kind of coming across it. And then suddenly there's this whole like, for me, there's a way that then say that makes sense of a lot of what's been going on in the scene in general. I think a comment I'll end at the end of it though is, one other big influence was out of Buddhism was a good friend of mine, a very good friend, became a monk at Plum Village, which is the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. And it's kind of funny because there's not, I mean, I don't know whether he ever came across integral or vice versa. But with Thich Nhat Hanh, it's not something very explicitly integral informed. And yet, obviously, the approach of kind of pretty deep social change and some of the kind of vision about that is there. But I think so just to say that was something that had been an influence. Why I'm mentioning is that they're also something that I'm aware of, and I'm sure many people in this space find, which is there are different kind of scenes or ecosystems that you can kind of suddenly see, they could really overlap or integrate, but which aren't yet, or something, are not yet, so self-informed. And, that that's happening, I think, more and more. Um, so in that sense, it was something like, oh, bumping up against, oh man, there's this, I wish I'd known this 20 years ago. This would have changed the whole trajectory of my life, but it's happening now. So that's great.
Yeah,
That
gotcha.
was how we came across metamodernism in that regard.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because there's this great map that came out of Life itself of mapping the metamodern and all that. It was one of
Yeah,
these really
yeah,
helpful, important contributions
yeah,
to these sort of liminal web mapping efforts, and so I think one of the challenges for this space, as you said, there's like different lineages. I mean, this is also its strength, but there are different lineages, different terms, different different aspects of the ecosystem that different things are touching. And I think that is both a source of a lot of rich diversity and strength in this space, but it also makes it hard to kind of know what to call this. And so, like, different
yeah.
frames and ideas have been thrown around. I'm excited by this naming of the second Renaissance as a way to kind of get our hands around some of the transformations that we're seeing, both latent and actual right now, to try to get an understanding of it that way. Would you kind of tee that up a little bit, explain how this second Renaissance as a term and as a project kind of relates to all this stuff you're talking about?
Yeah. So first, it might be useful to think like what you just said of like context, which is as a ecosystem or movement is emerging, it maybe doesn't have really common language, uh, different, different things that will one day maybe interconnect are calling the same thing different names. I mean, you mentioned this kind of Rosetta Stone problem. I describe
Mm,
this space, and it's often actually bewildering for people coming into the space a little bit. It certainly was for myself because the same terms, um, yeah, get named different ways. Like I was also an academic economist for a while. I was a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and there, for example, even things like in our space, like many people talk about Moloch or basically multipolar traps, but in more conventional literature, those are just called collective action problems and things like. I was
yeah,
like, what is
yeah,
Moloch?
yeah.
What is this thing? And or we use the term cultural paradigm a lot to describe this idea of an underlying fact that we are in a culture broadly than just being English or French or American, where there's some underlying kind of views or values, and then that's called effective value meme, essentially, if you're in the spiral dynamics world, and then there's other people invent kind of terms for basically similar things. So the first a comment on that. So one of the things that happened for us was as we were feeling our way, we started out and as it were, we knew certain landmarks, but for example, we hadn't come across Integral for a while, believe it or not. And then we kind of bump in it. And then there was this point around 2018, 2019, 2020, we're like, okay, well, what is this space we're in? How do we make sense of it? And I personally had this prior experience in technology and digital kind of activism around this analogy about kind of this idea of open data and open knowledge and what everyone's familiar with Wikipedia now and open source software. Many people on this podcast have probably heard those terms or certainly come across Wikipedia. And you might be aware, Wikipedia is this free encyclopedia, and it's not just free as in like free to use. It's like free as in freedom, like anyone can edit it and things. Those ideas, like calling those things and having a movement. I was part of something around open data where you had this similar problem of like many people calling the same thing. So I saw a space emerge once before. Um, and so one of the things we did at Life Itself around 2019, 2020 was starting to do like mapping and this kind of naming and interviewing people and trying to say, well, it would be really helpful if we had a common name for at least some things. And what is this space? Could we have a common name for it? And we wrote a first piece, which was we basically distinguished that we felt that there was these three common features of kind of actors in this space that would kind of help to start delimiting whether they were interested in paradigmatic change, like in deep social change in some way. It wasn't just making things better or improving capitalism or addressing its deficiencies. They really wanted a deep shift. But that's also true of like Marxists. So, but most people in the space were not Marxist, although they might be interested in it. So what was that? Well, the next point was they were integral or integrated. Whether they really knew integral, they tended to at least have this combination of inner and outer. Even if they focused on some, they were more inner focused or more outer focused, they had this kind of context and framework that was inner and outer. And finally, we called it pragmatic, that they were people who were often interested. Now, while they might be interested in meta theory or they, whatever you want to call it, they were also really seeking to apply that theory or research in some way. So they were kind of pragmatists or pragmatic in some way. So we called it PIP. And that was written actually in early mid 2021 and published. And then, originally we were like, okay, we were just going to push actually metamodern as the term. We were trying like, hey, there's various terms out there, but let's all address metamodern. And we still, would like a convergent term. I think what we've seen at the moment, there's liminal web, we actually have a catalog, we have a wiki page, an essay with like 8 to 10 terms that people use and their lineage and so on that you can find in the Second Renaissance Project. But over like 2022, 2023, one of the things is my co-founder, Sylvie, is an artist and sort of designer. I mean, one of the things I think is very strong about it, she's like, well, how do we make things accessible? How do we make things, I'm smart, but I'm not an intellectual. I don't read all of these, I'm not, kind of this galaxy brain reading all these things. And well, I want to make this communicable. And one of the things we found, which is not that we keep using those terms, it's like, okay, whenever we have like meta-Christ or meta-modern, we've got used to it. But most people, you have to explain what that is. So we were coming to saying, okay, there were two things. One was that we wanted a term for ourselves that we could consistently use rather than say, hey, insert 8 synonyms.
Yeah.
This is what we're working on, or this is what we're interested in, or are you interested in this? And it's true that we had that joke that, there's that XKCD cartoon of like there were 14 standards and none of them worked together. So now we've got 15. Let's solve that. But we were more or less than trying to create a standard everyone adopted, but we're saying, okay, Sylvie particularly, she went into the performance in Florence, an art performance there, performance art piece. And we were it was in Florence, it was the Renaissance. It was around this future. It's like the two futures we could have. I think at the moment it was called prophecy, the performance. But we can have a future that we see, which is obviously of collapse and of war and of famine and of really the things that we are confronting and are right now actually even quite probable in some ways, given the trajectory we're on. But there's also a breakthrough future. There's a kind of upwards bifurcation. And so that performance was around that prophecy, but we were kind of like this aspect of rebirth. Something is dying, a paradigm is dying and something's reborn. And there's this historical analogy, because obviously when modernity was born, when another major cultural paradigm we're in was born, the Renaissance in a way, at least in the West. And so this idea was the term, the Second Renaissance, as a naming for this moment of a time between worlds and of this idea of like needing a civilizational rebirth came up. And then of like also the other aspect of that as the initiative. So that was like this just one name that could be offered. And, so we could say, hey, we want a second Renaissance, or we're in a time of the second Renaissance, or and many ordinary people, while they won't know exactly what that is, they'll be like, well, what's the second Renaissance? At least in the West, they'll have a sense. Now there's some, just to emphasize, there's a Eurocentrism potentially of the term, though funnily enough, the term we were inspired by it. We'd come across it also from Francisco Varela, the great Chilean neuroscientist and finder of minor life. He actually used the term in the 1990s in his book Ethical Know-How in 1997. And we've seen it now a few other places. So it's a term that has a lineage in that way. And I think it is also nice in that sense of it's a moment, I think, if you like, in integral, where there's a reintegration of East and West of rationalism, of reason and intuition and the imagination and the spiritual. And so again, you could think of like also, just like in the Renaissance, the ancient Greek text kind of came back to Western Christianity. In this moment, Eastern wisdom traditions, that was the way Reeeeeal talked about it, of Buddhism, of Taoism, and so on, were being reintegrated with
Mm.
kind of Western reason into a new,
Mm.
kind of enriching both. And in
Yeah.
the same way, Sri Aurobindo, sees this in his stuff. So that was the second Renaissance as a kind of name and vision. And then there's the project is saying, okay, the other thing that we see is that I think the ecosystem in a broader sense is just an ongoing self-organizing, emerging process of connection. And it's not going to be possible to kind of say to everyone, let's use this necessarily, though as I said, we were advocating for the term metamodern, and we use it in the second Renaissance in the sense we say, well, the new paradigm's name, beyond postmodernity is metamodernity. That's the name of the paradigm we want in the second Renaissance. That's what we want to become. But the other thing that we found in the project that we think is useful is the freedom to lay out relatively clearly a theory, I guess a framing and a somewhat of a theory of change. But I think that's the other thing that I think would be valuable is not that everyone agrees on a theory of change, that term, but at least if people are clearer on where they think we're going and how we will get there, even if those are a little bit distinct, I think it would help a lot. I think there's sometimes the other thing in this space is if you go like on Instagram, I sometimes joke, and there's a lot of terminology that's like, we need this new X, or of course we need to do X, go beyond capitalism, or do this or do that, Y, or you can almost do a pastiche of it, kind of Age of Aquarius type stuff,
Mhm.
John Lennon Imagine. And it is important to be a bit more specific than that. So one
Yeah.
of the other things in the second Renaissance is there's these four, we call it the four noble beliefs, or four noble truths of the second Renaissance, which again these are not innovation, but they're a kind of synthesis. So one is that there is crisis, there is symptoms of really serious illness in our civilization, and that I think is more and more visible to people. But second is what we call that crises or polycrises, these multiple crises we see are actually symptoms and underlying kind of illness or disease, which is the metacrisis, which is in our kind of definition of the metacrisis. And again, it's one that's there's various definitions, or at least our synthesis is say, well, that means it's at the cultural foundations. If it shows up in our systems, in our economy, in how capitalism works. It shows up in mental health. It shows up in our institutions. But beneath that is the kind of foundations of our views and values and our kind of our deep human nature and our culture. And that's what makes it a meta crisis, is that it's in the cultural foundations. And then that's third noble belief or truth is, as in the Buddhism, after the bad news and the suffering, there's a source of suffering, is well-being is possible. So the third noble belief of the second Renaissance is that a radically wiser, weller world is possible. Cultural evolution is possible. We can shift. Once we had slavery, legal slavery, almost everywhere on earth, like at least in almost all large states, and we don't anymore have legal slavery. Women 100 and bit years ago, most states did not allow women to vote or participate in society in a whole variety of ways. And that's changed today. Well, there's a long way to go in addressing patriarchy and so on. That's a huge change. So cultural evolution is possible. Radical shifts. That means that the root of our society is possible. And finally, the kind of eightfold path. What is the path to that? And that's where, we get, again, I think this is there's many paths and a lot of discussion, but in terms of principles, I think clearly the inner dimension, the left quadrants, that's something that's been neglected in modernity. So the cultivation of our inner capacities, and particularly in what we would call developmental spaces, in environments that are consciously dedicating themselves to cultivating our inner capacities, are really central. And this idea of the emergence of pockets, a new culture arises not everywhere all at once, but in places of density.
Mhm.
And that's one aspect, and also movement building. So that's,
Yeah.
and then as an initiative, Second Renaissance has this vision, but now there's like what's called the Second Renaissance Oasis and other things. There's a kind of growing community of people, like local meetups and so on, where people are coming and, coming together around that, to kind of gather and take action.
Awesome. Wow. Yeah. So, okay, this has been great because that gives, I think, a wonderful overview for people who, maybe weren't familiar before with life itself, Second Renaissance, the vision, the theory of change, and highly recommend people check out both the life itself and the Second Renaissance website. There's a lot of stuff on here. You mentioned the community hubs as well. So anyway, I'll link those in this description. But so that all being said, now let's dive into some of this and get a little bit of our hands dirty here with some of the ideas, because so there's like so much resonance with everything that you're saying, that just, I think that, yeah, I think that was a beautiful articulation of this orientation in this space. And there's so much shared commitment to a similar vision, a shared set of values, a shared appreciation for the, co-arising aspects of inner and outer transformation. And so, and again, in many ways, both of these aspects, whether life itself or Second Renaissance specifically, are doing, great work, just clearly articulating that, probably in some of the best, most concise, elegant ways out there. So that being all said, though, that's the goal, that's the vision. How do we get there, right? How do we actually start to see this paradigmatic change occur? And maybe just as like an into that, here's a question, which is kind of a hardball question, and there isn't a good answer to it. But so it seems that it's the economy, stupid, to quote James Carville, but not in the sense of, in terms of politics, but in terms of system, right? This is, I guess, kind of the Marxist notion that, like, that base element of economic forces really is really, in the last analysis, kind of the thing driving so much of this. That's a claim. I think that there's a lot in the Second Renaissance framing and the adjacent communities, or I'll just refer to it as the Second Renaissance movement,
Yeah, yeah,
that is aware of Marxist kinds of ideas, but also isn't, recognizes the limits of a lot of Marxist and Marxian framings. But I keep coming up against this myself in trying to actually, put the, where, what would you say, the rubber to the road here, and like try to achieve change, because it seems like that the economic system seems to be the ceiling, or the limit for a lot of these transformations being able to take root in society. And somewhat cynically, maybe, but also someone could just say realistically, some of those examples that you gave of cultural evolution might be, might cash out in terms of just economic changes, right? Someone could say,
yeah,
well, the system of global slavery wasn't really as, pertinent or even, valuable anymore in a nascently, global capitalist emergent condition, and therefore there was a kind of economic incentive to also see the eradication of slavery, not just some moral kind of cultural change. And similarly, women entering the workforce and gaining more kind of social status. Well, when you look at how that also overlapped with developments in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, where right, you could make these economic
yes,
arguments that sort of like, well, maybe
yeah,
it's not cultural evolution, maybe it's these deeper structures of economic change. And then that raises a whole new set of questions. So I guess that's just sort of like a throw that out to you. What do you make of that set of ideas? And if there's any truth to that, is there a way that we can tackle developing new economic systems that would work in tandem with the kind of Second Renaissance world that we want to see emerge?
yes. Great question. One thing also I should just say, which remind me, as you said, I'm going to answer your question, was just also to emphasize the Second Renaissance project is kind of a life itself has been an initiator, but it's really co-created with several other people
Mm.
and who are co-stewards of that project now, including like James Baker, Danielle from from Limicon, and a variety of others. So just to say that that project is kind of co-stewarded and continuing to evolving. But let's answer your question here, which is I just recreate it is to say, well, one, there's a kind of theoretical point, and by theory I don't mean like abstract theory, but like a question of like sense making, like how does how does change happen? What is the role of the economy and economics versus kind of culture in causing things? And you know, what you were then asking, like, what would it, how would things cash out now? Like, how would paradigmatic change show up in terms of the economic structures? I think was the like kind of the last part of that. If I'm
Yeah, like two separate questions, I suppose, is sort of like, like grappling with the prospect that maybe economic systems are the deep driver of these cultural
yeah,
changes, what you make of that idea. But regardless, economic systems, let's say in the lower right, are going to have to factor into this emerging world,
yeah,
and so if you envision any specific kinds of transformations in that area.
yes. Well, I think that first of all, this first point, right? Just for listeners, may or may not be aware, but like there's a classic argument in like Marxist theory of like economics is the kind of base substructure and culture is superstructure. So economics determines culture in a way, and it's showing up in the points you made, like the classic. Well, no, it wasn't that people changed their views about slavery; it was that slavery became economically unattractive. Or at the very least, that greased the wheels of stopping slavery, or at the very, on the more pure Marxist view, it was the direct cause of giving up
Yeah,
slavery.
and just real quick to be clear, just to clarify, like I'm not necessarily
You're
making
not
that
saying
claim. I'm
that.
not
You're
saying
not.
that that's what I
No,
believe, but
you're not
that's an
saying that.
argument that could be made.
But it
So
can be
yeah.
an argument. I know you're not saying it, but I think it's worth just setting out. I think this is a really crucial question. I wish I could draw here, but what we want to think of, and we've discussed this quite a lot at Life Itself, and others have. And one is there's two things. There's a thesis we hold, which again I'm not as original, but it's one that we have a name which we call the primacy of being thesis. So the primacy of being thesis says at least at this historical moment, at this time, and perhaps more generally, the left quadrants, or culture and being. So culture, which is our collective being, and our individual, kind of have a primacy in driving social change. Now, of course, that does not mean they are exclusively the cause of it. So you were just saying there's technology in the economy, so the plow gets invented. This obviously really changes, agriculture and so on. And then that maybe leads to the rise of, gods that are monotheism and so on and so forth. The kind of classic, for example, argument the other way. There's a technology invented. It shifts kind of how society is organized, how people think. And this leads, the centrality of agriculture leads to these kind of gods that are control the weather and everything. But so I'm saying is that would be the primacy of economy or primacy of technology argument. So we're primacy of being. We're saying like the left quadrants in integral terms have primacy. And that doesn't mean there aren't other causes. So the other classic causes are there's like, I'd say there's being, there's technology, there's kind of, I would say structure, which includes the economy. So Marxism is a classic primacy of structure. If only we change the ownership of the means of production, if we just do that, then we'll be in our utopia. That will resolve, selfishness in human nature. Selfishness is caused by capitalist exploitation or feudalist exploitation. Exploitation will go away in this new world. And this primacy concept, I like, it's borrowed a bit from the primacy of the right hemisphere in McGilchrist, where I think what's really nice in that discussion of the hemispheres is it's kind of clear to any one of us that we don't want to lose one of our hemispheres. It's not like we only want to be in the right hemisphere without language, or only in the left hemisphere with our analysis and reductive worldview. However, in our, McGilchrist would argue, in seeing the world, in being in the world, we want one of those to be the master and one of those the hemisphere. The way, at least the ways of seeing, we're being a bit reductionist about the hemispheres, but we want to integrate them and we want one to kind of lead. And similarly here, of course, in any paradigmatic change or any shift in our society, there's kind of shifts in being, there's shift in culture, and there are shifts in technology and economy and so on, right? But which of them leads? Which of them has primacy? And so our basic view at Life Itself is that both as a matter of kind of sociology, of kind of like the science of how society works, Marx was mistaken. Like, that this kind of the fact he was a historical materialist, like the centrality of materialism and of the economy was just a mistake. Like, yes, really, this kind of causative structure is a complex ecosystem of causes where, being like changes in culture cause lead to things happening in technology, which leads to things happening in institutions, which lead back to causing things in being. But if we would unweave that a little bit and say, which has primacy, we'd say the being. And I'm going to give a couple of concrete examples to illustrate this, like of evidence. We could spend a long, this is a whole decades-long research project.
Yeah.
But the couple of ones that were really struck me. So one was Robert Putnam has this work. So this was long before really I was coming across this. In Italy. So Robert Putnam is maybe more famous for writing Bowling Alone, and he's this sociologist, and in the 90s wrote Bowling Alone, which is about the kind of collapse of American community, and he very probably one of the leading American sociologists.
Mm-hmm.
But actually one of his earlier books, which was written with two Italians, was about this natural experiment in Italy. So this is more about institutions and structure. So I said there's primacy of being, there's primacy of structure, and there's primacy of technology. And this natural experiment was that in about 1975, there's this major constitutional reform in Italy, and a lot of power is redistributed back to the regions from the central state. And this is kind of significant percentage of GDP of money moving back under the control of regions. And the question was, and Putnam's a smart guy, so he immediately gets, he teams up with this sociologist and said, we're going to study this. And the question was, what would happen? Would this, if institutions were determinative, well, then there should be this change locally, like maybe more empowerment, more accountability, whatever. And what they really found very crudely was in the north of Italy, where you had this, you had more civic participation, better, more participation in government, a variety of things that were kind of good happening. In the south of Italy, you basically didn't have good things happening. You either had nothing really happening, or it even kind of got worse. There was more corruption or things like that. And the point, roughly, they argued was that the culture of northern Italy and southern Italy, going back 1,000 years to the fact that the south of Italy was conquered by Normans, and even under the Romans had more slavery in the south and the north and stuff like that. But certainly under about 1100 or 1000 AD, the Normans conquered Italy. It's this hierarchical feudal state in the south of Italy for centuries, leading to this very kind of clientelistic, hierarchical power structures, and therefore corruption and kind of oppression. Whereas in the north, for whatever reason, you have these very horizontal structures that develop quite early of civic associations and cooperation, and then the city-states of the Renaissance. And that these cultural things are really determinative of how this structural change plays out. So when you have good culture, you get good results of this structural change. When you have bad culture, you don't. So that was one example where I felt it was clear that being in the form of the existing culture really determine outcomes. And obviously the experiments we've had with communism have really not borne out Marx's thesis. When we made these big structural changes, they haven't led to these results, whereas, and then, so there's also that kind of negative results that you've seen, particularly of structural change, changing the ownership of the means of production, or even the other examples of exporting democracy. We're going to go to Afghanistan and we're just going to put in, the US Constitution, and we're going to put in this, and we're going to put in that. And it doesn't really work well. Now, it may be kind of colonialist and things like that, but it also doesn't sound like we can copy paste structure. And the other example is, which I think is now part of a really important breakthrough in the last 30, 40 years in cultural evolution science, essentially. We're starting to have a science of cultural evolution in a rigorous way. Because in an unrigorous way, it goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years of speculation. There's Herodotus, Thucydides, which is people like Joe Henrich and his professors, Richardson and Boyd, starting to have this. And Henrich's story about modernity. So, if people know the weirdest people in the world, his book, the book is really asking why the West, this classic question, why has the West come to be successful, at least power-wise, in the last 1,000 years? Mm-hmm. And the answer he's saying as well, there's this cultural underpinning of modernity. And there's this kind of accident. Now, it's a kind of structural accident. you could say, or institutional accident, which is the Catholic Church have these views and values about, just to summarize his thesis, that there's these views on cousin marriage and of like the family, marriage and family program, he calls it, the MFP and his colleagues of the Catholic Church, which are kind of accidental, like for reasons to do with how Christianity is. It's like bad for you to marry your cousin. It's kind of, sacrilegious. You're not allowed, if your wife dies, you cannot marry her sister. That is not something you're supposed to do. There's like all of these kind of taboos that are instituted sort of by accident, and which turn out in anthropological terms to be really rare. But to make a long story short, the argument of Henrich is something like, okay, we have these weird set of kind of unusual set of kind of institutional or cultural norms that are then, institutionalized into the church. So, you get excommunicated if you have more than one wife. You're not allowed to have multiple wives anymore. You can only have one, like, official wife. Of course, you can have, mistresses and things, but they're not going to, the children will be illegitimate, for example, which is really important traditionally. Okay, and then that's going to get institutionalized. And then this is going to really form being in deep ways, and it's going to re-alter in the structural way society. So, for example, you're going to have a very unusual thing start happening, which is you basically destroy kinship networks. Because the way you make kinship networks traditionally work in societies is you remarry cousins. If you're my, you know, if you're my brother, and then we have children, and then like gradually the kin network is diverging. We kind of can knit it with cousin marriage and things like that. You don't have that, and that makes a world where I'm much more on my own to start with. I no longer have this kinship network that I'm related to. Now I'm kind of on my own, but that means I need to form bonds with people I'm unrelated to through marriage or through some blood ties. And so it creates this horizontal, I mean, his argument is it creates this world of much greater kind of democratic relationship and horizontal relating to. Is kind of painful in some ways, but after time you get this completely major innovation anthropologically in how society works. And that actually forms being. What's great is if you actually read, there are points he talks about things like the word ontogenetics kind of shows up in that book, because what we then see is that these things alter our psychology at a very deep level. So, for example, our trust, whether it's, I mean, some of that deep level is even in our kind of brain, but certainly things like how honest or how much we trust strangers, how we think about the world, how we categorize, the analytical aspect of things. And so that's another example where you have a strong argument, at least in his thesis, that modernity as a cultural paradigm is not coming about because of some economic change or technological change, because we invented X technology. That is not why the Renaissance happened. It's not, it's happening because of some deep cultural shift that's leading us to think of each other more as peers and so on. And that then is the basis in the Marxian version to invert it. Economy follows that. We then get more markets. So, for example, he's got great statistics about the prevalence of markets in medieval Europe is already way ahead of China. And why are markets important? Markets are interactions with strangers. I am trading with a stranger. Why would I trust you not to rip me off? It's actually very difficult to establish markets. I need to have trust, and I need to have certain other things that are actually quite hard to do. I mean, it's not that markets don't exist, but they exist in other places in much more limited or kin-based way. And so you're having that, which is the beginning of capitalism. You're having then you're leading to Protestantism, which is this real breakthrough of modernity where you kind of throw off the hierarchical truth comes from God and from the Pope to a much more horizontal model. And this is breaking through then into literacy. And then it's like, that's causing technological innovation.
So, all right. No, this is great. So this is very interesting too. Because I mean, so the point, that you've cited a number of examples for an evidentiary basis here is that culture is the deep structure. And I totally buy that. Just to, I guess, play devil's advocate a little bit, there is a question, and it seems to lead potentially to a little bit of an infinite regress or begging the question, because, like, for example, Like when the Normans invaded, why did that change the culture? Or when like when the Catholic Church said you can't marry your cousins, why did people say okay, right? If there wasn't like a deep culture being like, no, this is super important to us, we're, screw you, Catholic Church. You know what I mean? Like there's an interesting way in which people change behavior, yes, but then it's like why? And
Yeah.
we can begin to pinpoint these bifurcation points where these things change, but it ultimately in some ways doesn't, one could argue, give us that deep causal answer, because like why some things are allowed to shift the cultural rudder and others aren't seems to then again kind of keep you in this infinite regress of like why did that take hold and this didn't. I
Well,
don't know if you have
okay.
any thoughts about that.
Well, yeah, yeah. Okay. So just to say, first, I want to keep emphasizing that any solution says it's just culture. And first of all, in this story, there are going to be feedback loops.
Yeah.
But there's also, so what I mean is, culture is going to lead to institutions. For example, the church actually institutionalizes, we're going to excommunicate you. So just to take your example, it does come up against deep resistance. For example, Charlemagne does want to have multiple official wives. And there's actually moments the church like, we're going to excommunicate you. There are points where the church really has a fight with like existing power and existing kind of cultural norms, for example, of, concubinage or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you know why what I'm trying to say is there are clear moments where I think it's not, you can clearly say it's not because of some economic interest that it's happening. It's actually
Yeah.
having to overcome economic interest.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say is at the same time, it's obviously much easier when you can align, when, oh, well, then there's some feedback loop where you've created something that then reinforcing that cycle, right?
Yeah.
When you do something and then that leads to some kind of loop. And so there are other causative factors like the economic or technology, so let's take a silly example. Okay, in this, not silly, but in this case, at some point we invent the printing press. So we're already on the trajectory. And I think modernity is actually fairly well established before Gutenberg comes
Mm-hmm.
along. It's creating the context in which printing presses get invented. Though, of course, Gutenberg, by the way, is a devout Catholic. He's not thinking this is going to help the Reformation.
Sure.
But of course, we can see in the classic Eisenstein, and I mean the different, not Charles Einstein, but the printing press is an agent of change. If you know that book,
Mm.
there's this argument of like, okay, the printing press then as a technology is really crucial to supporting the Reformation. Without the ability to print lots of kind of material and distribute it, that would have been really difficult to disseminate the ideas of Luther and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, of course, then technology plays a role, and then technology like embeds capitalism and modernistic ways of thinking in a very deep way, that goes
Sure.
on today. So there's a complex interplay of these things.
Well, just real
But
quick on a
yeah,
thought on
no,
that point, is just that to your point, there are many instances where the same technology has been independently invented and it didn't have the same impact because of cultural differences, right? So, like
yes,
the steam engine, in a sense, was invented in ancient Rome, but it was basically only used in temples to have certain kind of almost like pyrotechnic sort of things happen when the god showed up, and never got applied in any kind of broader way. Similarly, gunpowder, and I guess what made me think of this was the printing press. Both of those were invented in China, much earlier, but the
yeah,
cultural context was very different, and so it didn't take on the same trajectory, arguably. So even the notion, if someone were to make a primacy of technology argument, there's many ways you could say, well, it's not, there we have many examples where that doesn't seem to bear out entirely as well. I just wanted to throw that in there.
yes, exactly. I mean, even and I came across this first because I was in a like civic tech space, a place of like applying technology for like civic good for about, from about 2000 onwards. And I felt there was often this very naive idea there because I'm not critiquing, but I'd also studied history. I was very interested in history, which I would have to say is one of the lacunae I feel of many people in the engineering tech space is
Hmm.
there's not a lot of historical context. It's like, this has happened before. And I was this kind of naivety of like, oh, if we invent this app, we'll fix democracy. There's kind of this aspect where you're like, well, look at China and social media. There was this argument like, well, it's going to democratize access to information and therefore it will just like kind of lead to democracy. And I think Evgeny Morozov was one of the people, I think, pretty brilliant mind. People know that, to fix everything, click here, and his critique of techno solutionism. This because what happens in a world where you think technology is kind of the kind of source, also you also think it's a solution to everything. Now you had a question of like infinite regress of like why do certain cultural ideas take off? And that was what I wanted to dig in, because you got it. This is where have I where I have it just so we have at the moment, I think, Peter Turchin, if people have come across, I think
Mhm.
it's another, there's Henrich. Turchin is a very interesting cultural evolutionist, again, doing rigorous now empirical work, but he calls it cliodynamics, so having,
Mhm.
historical data sets and properly testing hypotheses. Now, so what is it that's an engine? You ask, if we're going to have a cultural evolution question, we've got this kind of selection effect. Like, what's driving this? Now, his kind of answer is, well, competition and competition between groups. Why are we so cooperative? In some ways, the human species is like this ultra cooperative. Like, we're way more cooperative than chimpanzees and most other primates. We're kind of up there beyond even ants, who are like directly genetically related. Like, they are, kind of replicas in some ways. And what's driven this? And that's thrown up both, this is a genetic cultural co-evolution story where we are both, this is where like culture changes being over time. Just like we have cows with milk, gradually we become lactose tolerant. We actually change our genetic makeup. But there's also just a cultural shift of like becoming more and more cooperative. And he just makes the point, like, if you go back, let's say 100,000 years, we just like chart how big are the groups of people who are coming together to solve public goods problems, just even as a percentage of the society of the world, it's got larger. Right now, his example being the book is like Russia, the US, and China cooperate to run the International Space Station and to spend billions of dollars on this kind of cooperative venture. And that's, but we also can go back to even 8,000 BC, and, in Turkey, people are coming together in groups of hundreds to like move rocks around to make these kind of temples or
Yeah.
something. So, and his point though is there's competition. So how do we get, we know this problem of cooperation, which is at the individual level, well, I could gain by not fighting in the battle and letting you die, Brendan. I run away, or I just don't make quite as much effort, or I hang back a little bit. You go in the front line and, you get killed by the spear, and me being there doesn't make so much difference on its own, if I'm one of 1,000 of us. But obviously, if we all do that, that's a big problem. And so the classic argument is, multi-level selection. There's competition individually, maybe within the group, but then there's competition between groups.
Mm.
And if that competition, while we don't like the idea of competition between groups, actually it's a huge driver. Like, competition between groups is a huge driver of cooperation within a group,
Sure.
because groups that can cooperate. So when you go back um, to this question, like, what's the driver, like, of why something gets adopted? One answer to that is maybe it's a bit random. Like, why did the church do that? They certainly didn't do it because they thought it was going to be some good idea for cultural evolution. It's like they just have
Mhm.
some weird package that comes from Christianity, which is like just by kind of chance, maybe sort of makes it. But then there is a selection effect. Why something arises is kind of luck, and even maybe a luck, almost a little bit of luck that it sticks at the beginning. But then Christianity has a lot of pro-sociality in it. So again, citing our people like David Sloan Wilson in Darwin's Cathedral, talking about the role of religion, which we could come to, why religion is such a big role in supporting like our growing pro-sociality. He does this, it's not rigorous, like really rigorous empirical data, but he's pointing out that if you look at the late Roman Empire or the Roman Empire, basically ordinary Romans didn't reproduce above reproduction rate. Like, the population wasn't growing very, very much. And he's like, well, if you were Christian and you simply had a slightly higher reproduction rate, like you were growing at 1 or 2% over 2 or 3 centuries, there's actually you go from a tiny, tiny minority to a significant minority. And he then says, well, look, he has this kind of chapter where he's like, well, there are a lot of plagues. There are a lot of like disasters, natural disasters, illness of a kind, where collective support makes a big difference. So he points out that like many things, many kind of plagues, basically just fairly minor care, like providing fluids, providing, food to someone will really alter their chances of survival.
Hmm.
Now, the default model was to kind of run away from plague victims. But if you were a Christian, you were willing to maybe die for other your brothers and sisters. So you would care for them even when they're sick, even at risk to yourself. And he makes this argument in the book. This could be one reason Christians outperform like ordinary Romans in just like population growth
Yeah.
during the early to late Roman Empire. And so pro-sociality of this kind that existed in Christianity, and as we know, you know it all too well, but Christianity is kind of this breakthrough from Judaism, where to become a Jew was like really freaking difficult. Like, you had to do kind of years of stuff. You had to get circumcised. It's kind of pretty scary as an adult, as a guy. You had to do a load of stuff that was quite big deal. But Christianity, you had to basically say, well, I'm going to join this church. It was open to everyone if you became a kind of believer. And it had this, and it was pro-social, it was communistic at the beginning. And so what I'm saying is that one of the things that creates selection effects for then wider ways of being, and this is true of technology, but what ways of being might take off, and what then drives that selection is these kind of these flywheels that are there. So that's maybe not so random, and we could study what would take.
But here's so there's two things I want to get to here. One is I think more significant, and it gets to issues of value and how we have different kinds of value that may even overrule other more materially oriented values, and that this can be a driver of this. But putting that to the side, one of the things that came up for me though when you're telling that story about like the Catholic Church and the institution of no marrying the cousins and this and that, is that assuming that that thesis is correct and that basically some form of the modernization process begins there, it's kind of the takeaways from that are confusing for people like us who are engaged in the space that we're talking about, where we're trying to consciously see paradigmatic change towards a better future. Because it seems like a lot of these instances might just be these seemingly random, seemingly arbitrary, seemingly, like who would have thought that would have had these kind of cascading, butterfly effects down the line. And it would seem to, I don't know, cast a shadow over the very notion of conscious evolution, right? That like we could have the forethought of like how to actually make the world better. Maybe it's not going to come from all the stuff we're doing in the second Renaissance and Metamodern community. Maybe it will happen because someone invents a new kind of pen that, release, I don't know, I mean, like it's well, that would be kind of a technological argument, just not what I'm trying to get at. But I've always had this, like concern about that kind of issue. So maybe to pose that as like a question, what lessons can we draw from these kinds of instances? And I'm also thinking maybe of like, Jared Diamond, was it Jared? Yeah, I think Jared Diamond, right? He wrote the book about what was that? What was the name of his big book?
There's Guns, Germs, and
Guns,
Steel.
Germs, and Steel, right? And one of the arguments that he makes, is like that you see agriculture spread in the way that it does, basically because of the horizontally configured nature of the continents, and that can explain a lot of sort of thing. It's like a largely kind of highly contingent first, original conditions kind of thing has these cascading impacts throughout the complex system. There's a lot to justify that kind of approach, but for civilizational designers like yourself and myself, like where does that leave us trying to do this intentionally?
Well, it's a great question. So a couple of things, by the way, just to mention about Jared Diamond before I capture it. So I should have added a foot. I said I had onto what I'm going to call ontological solutionism or cultural solutionism, or primacy of culture. There's primacy of structure. So the way the economy is organized, or the laws, or structures like that, like the ownership to the means of production. And then I talked about technological solutionism. If we only invent AI, or if we only invented the plow or the printing press, that's what determined what happened, or that's how we solve our social problems, or create a paradigmatic shift. And then you also mentioned what I would call actually, I call like geography solutionism, or which does play a role. Like this guy, Peter Zeihan, you know, you know, who writes this kind of like geopolitical commentator, where it's very, very geographic solutionism. Like it's because the US has like two seaboards and has all this like resources, and those things are relevant, by the way, again, but I don't think they're nearly as determinative as like Jared Diamond suggests. And I mean
Mm.
they are important. Crucially, like cities are on rivers. Almost all cities are on rivers for kind of obvious reasons, at least for now. But yeah, it's not as determinative, I think, as people think in the medium term of what happens. But your real question was um, about, well, there's this accident. And I think this is a point where there's a kind of yes and no. So first of all, I don't think we have like rules. I don't think we're not cultural engineering. We're not trying to do culture engineering. I think of it more as like we're trying to be conscious cultural gardeners,
Mm.
like in a small way that we contribute, and that we're trying in some ways, you or I and others are trying to like put seed memes into the
Mm.
memosphere,
Mm.
um, that are healthy, that are productive. Like even the idea of hope, like even in the moment right now, I think a lot of people feel some degree of real despair when they look at the political situation, when they look at the climate situation, when they look at how we're treating technology, like just breakneck speed at which we're allowing like AI to develop without any really deep reflection. And so one thing we're seeding in this kind of podcast right now is hope. We're saying, listen, there are a lot of reasons to have concern. And first of all, there's a context that can help you make sense of this. Rather than this being a book like, why is Trump elected and why is this happening? You're like, actually, there's a context. Like as the paradigm of modernity is declining, as it is kind of basically kind of collapsing, these kind of breakdowns are common. If you look back in history, when the medieval era came to the end and modernity was born, it was a messy time when it was hard to make sense of things. The very grounds of like what truth was were shifting under people's feet. As a Christian, the most important thing is, will I go to heaven? How do I go to heaven? Well, is it through the Pope or is it through faith alone, solo fides? My God, I'm suddenly confronted. There's a group over there telling I'm going to hell if I do this, and another group saying that I'll go to hell if I do that. It's like, wow. So it's a confusing time. And secondly, we're saying hope. We're saying that you can engage in cultural evolution. Now, some of
Mm.
it's accidental, but we can be conscious. So we don't know what will always exactly work, but we can consciously cultivate seeds and we can put seeds out there and then we can nurture them. And I think we can see patterns. Now, we can still be wrong about them, but like I say this about plate tectonics, we still will struggle to predict when an earthquake will happen,
Mm.
but we can say likely where.
Yeah.
So I think at this moment, we can use what the kind of framework we're discussing on this podcast of like cultural evolution and cultural paradigms, like these big, like modernity with its core ideologies like individualism, rationalism, secularism, and so on. We can see how what's going on and describe things, and then play a role in saying, well, what are the new kind of core aspects of that paradigm that we'd like to emerge? And so one of them is saying, well, the last paradigm based is this huge neglect of the inner dimension of religion, of spirituality. It's not that it's not allowed, but it's kind of becomes really secondary. It's not,
Mm.
it's not really real. These experiences you're having aren't really, I mean, cool, you can have them, but they're not really real in some way. They're not real like the meat, measure, this earth is real. Um, we have this huge neglect of the emotions, of our inner life, and we become like not only go valuing reason, which is hugely important, but kind of reductively rationalist and so on. And we can see those flaws. We can say, well, we can at least say, okay, well, probably what's going to have to emerge is going to have characteristics around like wisdom, a reintegration of spirituality and religion. It's going to, value the inner world more than the outer world. It's going to support like inner being and seeing our interconnectedness. So I think we can play a role in that way. And I want to say something else here, which is a point I made at one point to Jim Rutt when we had this discussion. Because Jim was saying, like, some people think, oh, we're gonna have to outcompete. I even thought this one, we're gonna have to outcompete like economically the old paradigm. We have to
Mm.
offer something that's more productive than consumerist capitalism. It's
Mm.
like we're gonna have to win on its own terms. And that could seem really hard. Capitalism is really productive in many ways. I mean this even concretely. Like for people I encounter who want to live a different life, they're like, well, how do I make a living? I
Yeah.
want to spend more time on my meditation or my practice or in community. And like a real, like, how do I have a roof over my head? And that's a very real question. So you have to find ways. But one of the things, but what I want to emphasize in that was the analogy with the end of the Roman Empire, actually, because I think what we're in is less actually finding an analogous to the rise of modernity, which was the rise of reason and kind of like almost power system. And this is a point that others make, like Hansi make, and is there an integral. But the end of the Roman Empire, which was a power system, what rose with Christianity? Was Christianity more economically productive? Was what came after Rome? No, we actually have good data that standards of living in Western Europe did not really meet those of the late, the height Roman Empire until about 1300 or 1400, about 1,000 years later. But what did Christianity offer? It offered meaning.
Yeah.
And again, one of the stories from David Stone Wilson I found very powerful was where he describes basically it's a rich young Roman. I think of it today, just yesterday I was somehow came across an ad on YouTube or something. It's about this like $150,000 electric minivan with like 24 karat gold plating on the wheels. And this is the company, by the way, that makes the electric cars that Waymo use for their taxi service in the US, but this is their high-end version, and it's got like seats that massage you and like a 40-inch, TV screen in the back. And you're like, this is peak something, right? This
Mm.
this is decadence. This is
Yeah.
the end. And you look at this as a guy, he's a rich young Roman, he's a real guy, and he goes to the amphitheater, he's bored one afternoon, he wants to go see some people get torn apart or like fight each other to death. That's the Netflix of the day. So he goes along and he's not really very satisfied with this life. He's got it all, he's rich, he's there, he's in Rome. And it's a day some Christians are getting fed to the lions. And they die. Before they die, he sees something in their eyes, like a peace, a calmness that he realizes he just will never have.
Mm.
They have something that no amount of money, no amount of power in Rome is going to give him. And I think we're there at this moment in our society that, in fact, some of the wealthiest people in this world today know how empty they are, know how meaningless they feel their lives are. And they know that it isn't going to be getting the Porsche or getting a bigger TV screen or having more holidays even that's really, where they can go to some exotic destination is really going to fill that. They are looking for something else.
Yeah.
And so I think that, funny enough, in the meta crisis of the crises, the meaning crisis, and people kind of debate whether Vivek is correct, but I think you go back to Durkheim, the first kind of almost sociologist, and he's pointing out that in kind of capitalism, in modernity, suicide is going up.
Mm.
There's something that's there, and I think that's the thing. When I was talking, I remember to Jim Robert, I was saying, listen, Christianity didn't offer more money. It didn't offer people, wow, you're going to be even more productive. It offered meaning. It offered purpose at that point. And I think what, at the moment, the Second Renaissance, Metamodernism, Integral offers people is a kind of purpose at several levels.
Mm.
It's first of all that you can see yourself, and it can be a myth. We could debate, but as part of some unfolding. And it's not, as Wilber says this very clearly, it's not like Hegelian. We're not guaranteed the good outcome. We're not guaranteed that we move into the integral paradigm. It will take blood, sweat, and tears. Not maybe any kind of violent revolution, but it will take real effort on our part to manifest a wiser world. But wow, I could be part of that.
Mm.
That's what I could give my life to. Wow. And that you can see yourself not in some meaningless atomized universe with atoms, but I'm part of some kind of unfolding, whether you want to get mystical about it of consciousness, but just like, well, even on a materialist kind of cultural evolution basis that people can see, well, there is cultural evolution. Even materialists see that. And so I think that there's this kind of meaning on offer. And then there's the other aspect, which is you're offering the meaning, which is this is a focus to get back onto the inner dimensions and cultivating
Yeah.
our capacities of love and compassion, of spiritual connection, dare I say it, to Ant-Man or whatever you want to put to the universe that is there, that we've cut ourselves off with so much in
Mm,
modernity. So at this double level of both grand vision and personal, it offers something. And even then on the pragmatic level, if you see the challenges that I think lie ahead in our society as climate crisis worsens and so on, the power of community and reconnection
mm,
that these kind of visions offer, of community, again, of genuine community, and of genuine fellowship, of what I could call even spiritual fellowship in the true sense of like
mm,
being given, like the fellowship of the ring for a great purpose together, that's also a thing, right now, your individual, however rich you are with your like island getaway with this bunker, is that really going to save you when
mm.
the crisis comes? No, brotherhood and sisterhood and
Yeah.
fellowship is going to be what really makes a
And
difference.
save you for what, if not what actually matters, right? So, man, that was a beautiful articulation of so many crucial, vital, foundational ideas. So very well said, and I couldn't hope to say it any better. I mean, it was a wonderful tee up at the beginning of everything I was going to get at earlier when I mentioned value, like the difference of value that this raises, right? Because I think what you're getting at with your conversation with Jim Rudd is exactly it, that it's not out competing capitalism to make a better form of capitalism, that, or everything you said, but again, much more elegant. It's not that. It's that we change the world by changing what we value. And that is a primacy of being, and that is about something deeper than that technological, that economic, structural kind of thing. It's something that can outweigh or overrule our kind of more basic material senses of value and dollar value, to actually forego that in some cases for deeper, richer, more meaningful kinds of valuation. And when we can situate kind of economic value within a broader structure of values that we have, and actually situate it, lower down the spectrum than these higher values, that is a profound leverage point for collective transformation if people appreciated that. And that's why I very much agree, and why I think that these ideas are transformational. In the same way that, yeah, that the rich young Roman, encountering the fire in the eyes of someone driven by a higher purpose that they can't get in their ideological frame, their meaning frame, right? And wanting that, that is probably the most valuable thing that we as people look for, and it's probably the most valuable potential for collective social change. So that is very much how I see this movement being oriented, is around the realization of that, which is a very, very profound theory of change in itself, right? It's not the kind of theory of change that your CEO in a boardroom is going to be writing on a board, and or our product launch will do this. It's like deeply human, and it's really, in some ways, I think, what can't also be counterfeited, right? You can't just make a version of this that, oh, well, I know, the market can't capitalize on this. It'll try, it'll do its spin-offs and its counterfeit versions, but that is precisely what, in a sense, that form of valuation can't touch. And so there's a
Yes.
different kind of meaning and purpose and sense of commitment that comes from all of that. That's kind of sui generis. And so anyway, you kind of made the entire point for me of what I was going to get at. That's an incredible leverage point, intervention point, for trying to achieve a wiser, weller world. And I mean, I think that's kind of a place where we can maybe begin to wrap that up. There's not
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
more I'd want to say about
Yes.
that, but I'll throw it back to you if you want to say any additional words about any of this.
Well, I want to say maybe two points there that just come out of it. Yeah, just beautiful what you were saying there. I mean, exactly that this is the deeper value. And I think there's 2 points, which is that because the point I was making, because Jim was like, well, as I said, we need to outcompete the system. So the other point is for people into their kind of evolutionary thinking, like one of the great challenges that you could happen um, in in evolutionary thought is, well, you have this idea of fitness landscapes, right? But you could just think you're trying to, or better to think of the inversion of like if you think the other way around, you're trying to go down the hill to be like, rather than a local maxima, let's say it's a local minima. So you're trying to
Yeah.
get fitter, whether you're a better bird at kind of catching, you're a better falcon, or whatever it is. But you can also think that in cultural evolutionary terms. And so one of the things that I think is a challenge for people at the moment is like, well, we want to like fix capitalism and what it's doing, but we're going to do that by trying to fix the economic system. And the issue is that currently, like, optimized capitalism in a lot of ways, well, it's got these externalities within its system. It's like really down there.
Mm.
And there's the classic problem of being trapped in local
Mm.
maximum, minima in this
Hmm.
case, right?
Yeah.
I might have a really better place, a much better mountain to get to, but if to get to that mountain, I've got to go down to go back up, or in
Yeah.
this case, go out of I'm at the bottom of my optimal hill. I'm like kind of this way. I've got to go all the way up here, which is
Hmm.
getting less good, to then go into a much better thing. And this is my point here, just to on a several levels. So even if you're economically interested, it's very difficult to see that there are approximate tweaks, to basically move in the fitness landscape from where capitalism is within capitalism as an economic productive system
Mm.
to this like much better place that we could see, where we took care of the value of the rainforest, and we didn't trash our ecosystem and mean that our children don't have a world to live in that's fit for them. But it's very hard to do that. But within this value scape, I could do that, right? When I
Mm.
move out the economy, I can make these changes. So the metaphor here is, right, go back to Rome. I had to get less efficient. There was the dark age, but I got this other thing that I'm offering people, which is the true value, which actually call us. Now, it can get corrupted by the end of the Catholic Church, but at the beginning, it's really there. And the irony is that whole system, in the long run, it produced an economic and social system that's actually way more
Yeah.
productive than was there in ancient Rome. But it wouldn't have got there by trying to optimize the Roman system more.
Yeah.
And so similarly right now, I think what people sometimes hope is like, oh, there's a way to reform capitalism. We're going to have like Green New Deal, and I'm like, I don't think you're really going to fix the climate crisis without going to this value level, without
Mm.
really addressing the paradigm we're in. Within capitalism, the incentives to chop down the rainforest, the incentives to keep emitting CO2 are so great that without this kind of waking up at this deeper level, so not just going, oh, well, we care on an accounting basis about the whales or about the biosphere, but we care on like a profound value level, like a profound sense of our connection with nature. Like, what are we doing to ourselves? It's like when we use that term, raping the planet, like that profoundness of like, what are we doing? You know?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, that aspect, my point there is to say that even another sense, if you want a different socioeconomic system, which many people want without even looking at the value, I'm kind of saying, well, you need something else to help you get off your optimal hill, to get through that valley, to kind of incentivize you to go where you're getting less good at production. And so my point here is, for example, many people talk about, and I've even talked about like, well, imagine teal companies, imagine how productive we could be if we're all cooperating and we're all egoless. It's kind of true. So you can imagine, a world built on like open source information, if we're sharing everything and we're really productive. We saw that. We saw it in the early internet, how productive it is. But we've also seen what it became.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the beginning of Silicon Valley was like hackers. We're just going to share everything, man. We're just going to build stuff because it's cool.
Yeah.
There's this famous moment where like Bill Gates shows up at the computer club. I don't know if you know the story, but these guys are like ripping off, and like everyone's like, well, but dude, of course everyone's ripping off your software. We all share our software. We're not selling it. And Bill Gates is like, no. He shows up at the homebrew computer club and it's like, no, I'm gonna sell my software for money. Like, what are you doing, dude? That's not the way.
Mm.
And that ended up dominating the system. What I'm saying, that other system is actually in the long term more productive, a system where we
Yeah.
really cooperate. But what I'm trying to get at is you're not going to get out of the optimum we're in and across to the higher mountain.
Yeah.
It's going to take something else. So I
Sure.
just want to make that point because many people are like, oh, we want to break through in social and economic organization. I'm like, sure. And we want teal companies, we want teal capitalism and stuff, but that's not going to happen through proximate change right now. It's
Yeah.
at this deep level we need the shift.
Yeah.
And the other thing I want to say, which is a bit of a segue, maybe if we want to talk at all about religion and spirituality and other things, is How does that happen? So it's easy to say, well, we need different values. The thing is, we believe together. It's very difficult for us as human beings to have very different beliefs from those around us. I mean, even from your family, I know in my case, I can point to what I call, uh, I think of sometimes switching paradigms like escape velocity, or you're shifting from water to gas. You need to get enough heat to kind of evaporate and become a different state, a different, um, you know, form. And I was several failures of that, where I was like, I knew after my university, I really wanted to go a different path. And then I remember like my parents being like, but, it'd be so good if you were like a professor or an academic. And, I was like, oh, I really respect my parents. I really love them. Maybe they're giving me good advice. Maybe this idea of going off and being like kind of a Dharma bum or trying to start some kind of community in rural France. It's a crazy idea. And it's really hard. So the other thing I want to say to people listening and is generally, okay, so we need a new paradigm. And how does that pragmatically begin? You need to be around others and
Mm.
not just listening to podcasts. You need to interact with people daily, weekly, who are in. Now, the great advantage of online is you don't have to go and live right now in some kind of community or village or something, but that helps. And it doesn't need to be a communal setup. It can be a village. It can be whatever. But we believe together. So this idea of these pockets, how does new paradigms begin? It goes back to experimentation as well. We don't know the exact combination of memes and views and values and practices that are going to make this work, but we have an idea. But we want lots of experimentation, and that needs to happen in dense pockets
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's why the hubs at Life Itself and many other people, you at Sky Meadow, what I'm now saying, I know other people like called the archipelago. There's
Yeah.
starting to be these islands of this emerging. And as they maybe like knit together a little bit in some way, you start to have, a global network of this.
Hmm.
But you want to have these islands where people are experimenting, embodying, doing this and practicing. And that's where the developmental spaces and the Life Itself hubs, this idea of spaces where inner capacities and an orientation towards metamodernism, the second renaissance, insert your term, is at least consciously there. It's maybe not the end all and be all, but it's consciously in the space.
Yeah.
Those two factors, a cultivation of inner capacities, it might be while still, earning a living and doing other stuff. It's not the only thing you're doing. It's not just a monastery, but that is central. And the context of the second renaissance or whatever is there.
Yeah.
Are what I would say are distinguished pockets of the new
Totally.
paradigm coming
Yeah.
into being.
Yeah. Well, that's a great
Point.
great, I guess, thing also to tee up just for people who are interested in that. Check that out. These are offerings at the these hubs, and there's information about these hubs that people can get involved in. And again, I'll put the link for Life Itself in the description. And it's quite a beautiful place that you've got there. It looks like in Bergerac. I guess there's a couple of hubs. So if people are interested in that resonates with people, I would encourage them to check that out. I'm hoping to be there over in Bergerac at the beginning of next year, or in springtime of next year for a little bit, and I'm looking forward to experiencing that firsthand. But yeah, I agree. The building of culture. Not, I mean, we tend to talk about culture often in this abstract sense, and that's a meaningful concept of like, cultural evolution, cultural change. But then there's culture between people. There's like the culture of, what it's like at a Metamodern Spirituality Lab, or a culture of, these groups when they come together. And that's that really intangible but not abstract sense of culture that's what really, fires this in a profound way. So we can't afford to lose sight of that, because that's key.
Was just was saying that it just right, is key. And I want to say also sometimes neglected in a good way in our podcast culture, like in our culture in general. The things we can talk about um, are often easier for us to communicate out. But things like the actual embodiment, there's people who are good at talking about things and good at doing, and sometimes they're the same people. But I want to emphasize just how crucial is embodying these ideas. And that's where there are hubs, but I want to emphasize we've got this project in collaboration with Commonweal, with Excaret, with the Fetzer Institute and others on developmental spaces. And this idea, it's much, there's Life Itself are doing, but there's obviously there's Sky Meadow, but I'm thinking like Monastic Academy, there's Tamara, there's Echo Villages, there's, been
Yeah.
intentional communities around for a long time,
Eudaimonia. Yeah.
Eudaimonia, but there's a developmental spaces project that we've been collaborating on, trying to like start to describe this, and this idea that we need these kind of spaces that are consciously cultivating our inner capacities and this kind of new paradigm. I think it's really something that's also emerging. And I also just want to emphasize, I think studying and talking to people who are embodying that and what we can learn is also a really crucial thing at the moment. I think our science of what makes communities work in that way, like conscious, what I call conscious communities, is in its infancy. And there's another thing we could spend a whole podcast like talking about, but I really want to emphasize that, which is that is something, that embodiment of this is really, really important. And one of the things I don't want to say is it's certainly not unique, but it's quite like at Life Itself that we've tried to both talk about the ideas, but actually try to walk it, like actually live ourselves in that kind of community, develop them. And boy, have we got some learnings from that. But it's not straightforward.
Sure.
And it's really, really rewarding and powerful. And also, I think it's crucial that we're doing it, not just talking, not just us, but in general as a community, that we're doing it as well as talking about it.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And kudos for you for trying to walk that walk and learning the lessons that we all need to learn. And that is such a big thing, and I see it a lot being involved in these online communities and online forums and things. And it's one thing to talk about development and interpersonal skills and these kinds of things. It's another thing to be around other people and practice them, and sometimes that can be felt as a very profound difference. But I think we're not doing ourselves the favor, any favors, and we're not doing the real work of what we're getting at if we're just talking about this stuff and not actually putting it into practice and living this out in the world. So that's kind of what it's all about. I feel like this was an incredible conversation. I want to kind of draw to a close and just thank you, Rufus, for the incredible work that you're doing, for the incredible way you were able to articulate some of these core things. Just, it was very inspirational, and I, at a personal level, really appreciate what you shared. It's helpful for me, especially as it is easy to get in your head. You're thinking sociology and leverage points and complex systems and this and that, but like to really come back to what really matters is really the whole thing, right? Like what actually matters, what is of value, what is meaningful, and to really understand the deep significance of that at so many levels. That's the most important thing. So I appreciated very much you speaking to that so well. But thanks again for coming on the podcast. Links in the description for checking out all the work that you're up to. And yeah, until our next conversation, my friend, I'm looking forward to it. So Godspeed.
Thank you so much.